Yeah.
Well, awesome. We are 3 past the hour, and I want to make sure that you get your time in today. So I will hand it over to you to get started.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And again, welcome back, Ashley. And I just want to thank Lakeisha again last week for all her help in doing the comments and people's questions. So this fourth week is where we dive into mindfulness of thoughts. And I'd be really curious as we get into this today a little bit, and I'll maybe Ashley remind me to circle back to this at the end too. I'd really love to hear you all's thoughts on the placement of this discussion in this 5-week course, because I've done it a couple of ways where I've talked about mindfulness of thoughts right after the basics on mindfulness and coming into the body, so that mindfulness of thoughts is kind of the second or third class. And I've done it now where it comes more toward the end. And so I'm curious where you would think that having this talk about mindfulness of thoughts would be most beneficial to all of you. So maybe keep that in mind as we're going through all of this. And before I share my screen, I also wanted to just follow up on something from last week that occurred to me that I don't think I mentioned when we were talking about the mindfulness of emotions, and especially the RAIN practice. And that is that the RAIN practice can be used throughout your day. And so when you practice it more in that formal setting, going through that process of recognize, allow, investigate, and nurture, you can begin to bring that into normal, so to speak, everyday minutes, so that you can kind of go through a really quick RAIN process when something is coming up for you. And so I just plant that seed for you all to think about and to kind of hold in the back of your head. And sometimes, again, if you can just do the first two steps, the recognize and allow whatever's coming up, that can be helpful in the moment. So I just wanted you to know that that's a technique that doesn't have to be limited to just your formal practice, that you can bring that into the rest of your day also. So before we get into today's discussion, I just wanted to check in and see, of course, if there were any lingering questions from last week, any feedback on the RAIN practice, and just curious if folks actually had a chance to try to work with the RAIN practice and what was coming up for you. So if you are inclined to share, you can throw that up in the chat while I'm getting the screen ready to go here this morning. All right. Ashley, can you see the screen okay?
Yes.
Okay,
And we did
great.
get one response. Very helpful. I was using it on external stressors. Crystal says, I have been bragging about it since the end of that session. Awesome.
That's great, Crystal. Yeah, you can be like the poster child for the RAIN practice. This is awesome. Everybody try it. Yeah, I love that. Cool.
Christina, yes, it saved me from overreacting.
Ah, yeah. Fascinating. What cool feedback for yourself to know that you could use a practice. First of all, that you had the wherewithal to use it, and then that it actually helped you keep from overreacting. That's pretty cool, Christina. Thank you.
Yeah, that's mindfulness in action, just that awareness piece right there.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So today, with the mindfulness of thoughts, we'll, of course, always begin with our grounding practice. And then I like to share this story, actually, an excerpt from a book, and use the ocean as a metaphor for our mindfulness of thoughts, because I think it's just so powerful and it can be a really good visual aid. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And then we'll talk about the stories that we tell ourselves. And my invitation to all of you is to start writing your own story differently, kind of throwing out the old storybook, the old rule book when it's not working for you. Don't have to throw out all the things that are working for you, but just starting to think about, what stories have I been telling myself that aren't serving me, that are holding me back from the things that I want, what I want to achieve, my level of resilience. And so we'll talk a little bit about our storytelling minds and why it's so easy for us to go down into the stories that we're told about ourselves. And of course, because it's mindfulness of the body, I want to touch on our body's reaction to stress that's caused by the thoughts that we're having. Then I'll throw out an informal practice technique for working with mindfulness of thoughts. And then we'll do our formal practice today, which again, I think I'm going to change it up a little bit. I kind of like going with the flow. Um, so, yeah, I'm going to kind of we'll do another mindfulness improv, basically, where I'm going to kind of meld a bit of visualization along with the formal practice that we'll talk about. And then we'll have our question and answer period. So before I move on to that, Ashley, are there any other questions or follow up from last week?
We had Crystal, just again, her counseling colleagues loved it. Christanne said, great way to go into my mid-year review, which I love. That's awesome.
Yeah. 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 That can definitely be stressful. So good job using that to help understand how you were showing up for that mid-year review. So as always, let's take a few moments here at the beginning to allow ourselves to drop in here, really collect our awareness together, and honor the space that we're sharing together, all of us here this morning, almost 60 of us here this morning, which is just pretty incredible. So if you haven't already, go ahead and get yourself in a comfortable but alert position, and we'll do a short grounding practice. Allowing yourself to settle into whatever posture you've chosen for yourself here today. And noticing what it feels like to give yourself permission to just be here for the next 90 minutes. Noticing what's coming up for you as you arrived here today. Were you feeling rushed, tired, not sure you had time to squeeze this into your day? Were you excited and ready to dive into today's discussion? Just noticing whatever sensations and emotions and rush of thoughts are coming up for you right now. And allowing yourself to settle in, closing down your eyes if that's comfortable for you. And collecting our attention and awareness here together by beginning with a few long, deep inhales and exhales. Inhaling through the nose with a deep breath, as deep as you can, filling up the chest and the abdomen. And then releasing that air through the mouth gently and slowly, with maybe a slight sigh, inviting the body to relax and settle in. And again, inhaling through the nose, maybe a slightly deeper breath if you can. Noticing the air filling you up, and gently releasing the air through the mouth with a bit of a sigh, inviting any tension that may want to relax or release a little bit to do so. And one more time, inhaling through the nose, maybe your deepest breath yet this morning, inhaling all the way into the belly, and then releasing through the mouth with an audible sigh, maybe dropping the shoulders and allowing yourself to settle in and arrive here fully. And whatever was coming up for you as you came here today, inviting you to let that go as much as you can, or just let it run in the background as you gather your awareness more fully on the sensations of the breath. Seeing where you can notice the breath the most to establish that anchor to the breath for yourself. And for the next couple of moments, following the breath all the way from the inhale to the bottom of the inhale and the exhale all the way to the top of the exhale. letting the awareness rest on the breath, however it is for you today. Knowing that your anchor is there for you whenever you feel the urge to maybe pick up the phone or check your email or check a message here today. Giving yourself permission to be fully present, fully here for the next hour and a half. Inviting some gentle movement into the body, maybe rolling your shoulders or your neck if that's comfortable for you. Giving yourself a little stretch or wiggling your fingers or toes. Noticing the breath is still there for you. Bringing your anchor with you. And slowly beginning to blink your eyes open if they've been closed. Noticing the light coming into the room where you are. And maybe just taking a long, deep inhale and exhale again as you come fully back into presence. As I mentioned, I think that the ocean is a really beautiful metaphor for learning to work with our thoughts. And I'd like to read an excerpt for you from a book by Dan Siegel called The Mindful Brain. He writes, "The mind is like the ocean, and deep in this ocean, beneath the surface, it's calm and clear. And no matter what the surface conditions are, whether it's flat or choppy or even a full gale storm, deep in the ocean, it's tranquil and serene. From the depth of the ocean, you can look toward the surface and just notice the activity there, as in the mind, where from the depth of your mind, you can look upward toward the waves, the brain waves at the surface of your mind, where all that activity of mind, thoughts, feelings, sensations, and memories exist. You have the incredible opportunity to just observe those activities at the surface of your mind." I love that metaphor for the ocean and your thoughts because through mindfulness, like Siegel talks about with the ocean, we can learn to just observe our thoughts like waves on an ocean and know that they are temporary and they will always give way to something else. Like waves on an ocean, which are real, we can see them. Our thoughts also seem real, and we'll talk about those too. Yet with our thoughts, they're not necessarily true. And we will talk about that, and that might bring up some questions for some of you. The notion, though, is that we are not our thoughts. Just like the ocean is not purely its waves, we are not purely our thoughts. And just like the ocean can't get rid of its waves, even on the calmest day when it looks like the ocean is just glass, there's still little ripples, still little waves. So, as I've said before, and there have been some questions around this, we are not trying to get rid of our thoughts. If you get rid of your thoughts, you're probably no longer here. We are simply trying to observe them. And by observing them, understand that we don't have to identify them. We don't have to be our thoughts, especially when they're not serving us or when they're holding us back. And we can make room for everything else, just like the ocean makes room for so many things within the ocean itself. that it's not just its waves and you are not just your thoughts. So there is room for everything else. So what we're trying to do is really notice that space between the waves, the space between our thoughts. We're simply trying to notice and not get rid of them. And the reason is that, as Shakespeare said, for there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. And that notion prompts some interesting discussions for sure. Because for some people, it's understandable how that is a hard pill to swallow. There is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. How we perceive a situation or a person or ourselves, and how we think about some judgment and apply that judgment to the situation or person or ourselves. And then we have made it true. So the reason this is sort of our go-to and why we're, as human beings, it's so easy for us to do this and not even notice it, is that we have these storytelling minds. Stories are so powerful in our lives, about the stories we tell about ourselves, about the people we know, about circumstances, the situation in the world, whatever it is. We have stories that we don't even know that we're telling ourselves. And my meditation teacher, Jack Kornfield, says that we must understand the power of the stories we tell and differentiate them from the direct experience of life. And so, what is that direct experience of life? That goes back to what mindfulness is: paying attention on purpose to the present moment without judgment. So, when we can be in a direct experience and have that first wing of mindfulness, the awareness of everything, that we're in this experience, that thoughts and emotions are coming up for us, and then bring in the second wing of mindfulness, the non judgment, the compassion piece, to say, okay, this is what's coming up for me. This is what the situation is. And try as best we can to bring compassion and non judgment to that situation. That's when we're allowing ourselves to be in the direct experience, as opposed to getting wrapped up into a story about the experience and sort of going down that rabbit hole. There's a saying that I think, I don't know where the saying came from, but the saying that the mind is a wonderful servant, but a horrible master. And in my experience, people sometimes feel that they are at the mercy of their minds. I can't stop my thoughts. I can't stop these thoughts from coming up. That's totally normal and understandable. And that's the mind being the horrible master. And we want to try to make the mind be our servant, to serve us, so that we can also show up as our best self and serve others too as a consequence. This storytelling mind is the equivalent of having a shadow companion or some imaginary companion who's always chattering in your ear, always just kind of in the background or maybe in your head or by your side, constantly talking to you. It's almost that sports play-by-play, everything. Why is she wearing those shoes? Why is it raining outside? That person cut me off in traffic. What a jerk they are. I can't stand my boss. Why is your boss being so mean? Why is my boss being so mean to me? I'm too fat. I'm too ugly. I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. It's that constant stream. And it doesn't shut up. It's always there. And so recognizing that we can't lock it in a closet or stomp on it, how do we learn to work with that constant chattering companion? And I want to emphasize here that it's not the entry point for mindfulness is not to try to just think positive or to try to reverse engineer those thoughts or try to change those thoughts. That may come with time, with the practice of mindfulness. What we're trying to do here is, again, to notice the thoughts and to not have judgment, which means not believing the thoughts that aren't serving us, the thoughts that tell us at the bottom of all of those thoughts, whether it's I'm not smart enough, pretty enough, educated enough, good enough, fast enough, whatever it is, at the bottom of all of those thoughts is what we call in the coaching world the gremlin. This gremlin of I'm not good enough, this not enoughness. And that's kind of like the big mommy or daddy gremlin, and it has all these little baby gremlins. So there's this I'm not good enough at the top, and then all these little offshoots of I'm not smart enough, pretty enough, fast enough, whatever enough. So recognizing that at the root of all of those kinds of thoughts, including ones that we're having about other people, like they're not smart enough, they're not good enough, nice enough, whatever it is. At the bottom of that is the notion that they're also not enough. And so, again, we're just trying to recognize, bring some awareness to those thoughts that not enoughness is certainly not true because you are enough. You truly are enough. But we continue to just kind of tolerate this chattering. We're sort of seduced by it. Again, these stories, we get very wrapped up in them. We get very attached to them, even when they're not serving us. So I just want you to think about, and if you're comfortable, please throw up in the chat. Think about a story that you've just bought into about yourself that you've never thought to challenge that story. Just think about that and think about maybe how many of those stories you are telling yourself, because we've been conditioned to believe certain judgments, worries, ruminations about ourself, and all of that ends up making this perception of us and the world that we are living in and how we think our lives are and what they could be. And so if we start bringing awareness to those stories, that can start to shift how you look at the world that you are in for yourself and what the world could be for you. So mindfulness helps us to really identify the thoughts as just thoughts. Just like we identify the waves in the ocean as just waves. When this slide says, what if thoughts are real but not true? That's what I mentioned earlier, that they seem and feel very true. And thoughts can have very real impacts on our body that we'll talk about in a moment. And very real emotions come up with those thoughts. But I will challenge you, whatever thought it is that you are having about yourself, about the world around us, about other people, how do you know that that's true? And I mean true with a capital T. So start thinking about what assumptions, what evidence, what facts are behind those thoughts for me. And keep sort of peeling back the layers on those, asking, well, is that true? Even that fact, is that true? And yes, we could get into all kinds of debates about facts. I'm not saying there aren't facts. I'm saying that when you're talking about what you believe about yourself, how true is it that whatever you have based that thought on, how true is that underlying past experience or comment that somebody said about you? So again, I'm not saying there's no facts, anything like that. I'm just extending the invitation to start questioning the stories that you tell yourself. When we do this, get caught up in these stories, we get up in this mental control tower. So everything is up here. And we're constantly wrapped up in story after story after story. And what that does is going back to Jack Kornfield's quote, it really pulls us away from the direct experience, the present moment of what's really happening. So let me see if I can break that down a little bit. If you are, we'll take a pleasant, going back to last week and the pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral feeling states. If you are in a pleasant situation, maybe it's just a nice day outside or you're with a bunch of people, whatever it is, and you're in this pleasant situation, your mind even then might start telling stories about it, which is completely normal and can serve you. And yet sometimes those stories might lead us into that grasping, like I was talking about. Oh, God, I wish I could be around these people all the time. Or I wish it was sunny outside all the time. Or I wish that I could be this good at my job all the time. And then we start getting into these stories and we lose track of the present moment. What's here for you right now? That you're still here with these people at happy hour, that you're still here at your job doing your work, that you're still outside for a walk and the sun is shining down on you. So it's sort of being mindless when we're in a situation and we allow ourselves to get lost in thought. Does that mean you should never get lost in thought? No. Sometimes it's fun. It's totally fun to fantasize and plan sometimes. Again, we're talking about recognizing the thoughts and the stories that aren't serving you. And I want to emphasize that this is common. Everybody, I think anyway, has these stories, this not enoughness that comes up about themselves. And I love this story about John Steinbeck because virtually all of the great thought leaders, spiritual leaders that we know of and hear about all had these doubts about themselves, all had these disserving stories that they told themselves. And John Steinbeck, one of our greatest American authors, had this quote, the story they told about how I am assailed by my own ignorance and inability. Sometimes I seem to do a little good piece of work, but when it is done, it slides into mediocrity. And this is the man who wrote Grapes of Wrath, gave us some of our greatest novels. And yet he still felt this way about himself and his skills and his work. And if he'd allowed himself to keep buying into those stories, think of what our world would have been deprived of with his art and his writing. And so, another question I'll plant for you is what could you be depriving the world of by believing some of the stories that you're believing about yourself? When we work with mindfulness to raise our awareness about thoughts, again, we are working with those two wings. So, as I said, we're bringing awareness to the thought, not trying to change it or push it away or shove that chattering companion in a closet. We're trying to become aware of it and then extend that non judgment and compassion to ourselves or to the fact that we're having the thought or to the person that we're having the thought about. There's some keys I want to pass along just to kind of again remember, because working with thoughts can be tricky. And I don't want people to get wrapped up in their thoughts about how they're not able to work with their thoughts. So don't get in that kind of loop. So here's some keys to just to kind of keep in mind. First of all, our minds are always on, as I said. We are not trying to turn them off. Our brains are designed to think. So the goal is not to clear them of thoughts. And again, just because you can think a thought doesn't mean it's true. So just because you're thinking or believing that you're a failure or ugly or not good enough does not make it true. It may cause you to take actions that continue to reaffirm that thought, what we call a self-fulfilling travesty. So if you keep thinking, oh, I'm not good enough, and then you keep not trying hard enough, then you keep reaffirming the fact that, oh, I'm not good enough. I'm a failure. And getting down to the next sort of key here, this no need to identify thoughts as good or bad. This again is the compassion wing, the non-judgment wing. So when you notice that you're having a thought that maybe I'm a failure, I'm stuck at this job, I'm an awful parent, whatever it might be, not only do you want to just bring awareness to that thought, but there's no need to then judge the thought itself or to judge yourself for having the thought. You see, we're just constantly in judgment mode, which again is okay. If a thought didn't have some underlying judgment, it wouldn't even register as a thought. So when I say there's no need to identify thoughts as good or bad, it's just let them be what they are without believing them or identifying with them. And the last key, which I think is a really powerful one, actually, just to kind of bring some science into this, is we refer to this in the mindfulness world like seeing the waterfall of thoughts, because thoughts really are like drops in a waterfall. There are approximately 17,000 to 60,000 thoughts that we have every day. So you are not going to notice all of those. You're not even going to notice half of them, or a third of them, or fraction of them whatsoever. Just like if you're standing at a waterfall, you're not going to notice every little drop of water that actually makes up that whole waterfall. The key is just to observe some here and there. And instead of standing under the waterfall and allowing it to beat the crap out of you as you're standing directly underneath it, take a step back and just be the observer of it. So instead of allowing your thoughts to just rain down on you and beating you up, by observing them, becoming aware of them, we can kind of take that step back and be the observer of them. When I broke that math down, by the way, I was super curious about it. If we have 17 to 60,000 thoughts a day, if I did the math correctly, and I'm not good at math, but if there are 86,400 seconds in a day, 86,400, that means that we have a thought every 1.4 to 5 seconds. So that's the waterfall, a new thought every 1.4 to 5 seconds. And you are not going to notice all of those. And that's okay. There is an impact, though, of this constant stream of thoughts, and that kind of beating up that I mentioned, that's stress. That is what creates the stress in our lives. And that is going to be different for everybody. So when we're talking about stress, stress is very subjective. It's our perception of a situation, and that's going to be different for everybody. So for example, some people may really love running marathons. Some people, that would be complete torture. And so for that second person, the thought of running a marathon is going to be stressful. So what's enjoyable for one person could be stressful and unenjoyable for another person. What we're looking at is the emotional and physiological tension or strain that's occurring from putting ourselves under that stress, from the unenjoyable things in life, from the stories we're telling ourselves. Stress also has two sources. There's the external and the internal. And our external sources of stress that we have thoughts about are things like traffic, financial issues, work, social relationships, family relationships, nutrition. All of these things kind of outside ourselves that we have thoughts and stories about, those are external sources of stress. And then we have internal sources of stress, which are our own thoughts and our negative interpretations of those thoughts that create unpleasant emotions for us. So going back to the awesome equation I talked about last week, pain times resistance equals suffering. If we're having thoughts about ourselves or a situation, not only could those thoughts be a form of resistance, but then if we start judging ourselves for having the thoughts or the actions we take because of the thoughts, that's just layering on resistance. And so we're increasing our suffering, i.e., increasing our stress. So, as with thoughts, the point is not necessarily to get rid of all of our stress because we will always have stress, and a certain amount of stress is okay. So, for example, when you are, I go back to the working out, you're putting your muscles, your body under stress, which is vital for you to be increasing your aerobic capacity, increasing your muscle mass. So, stress is not always bad. And going back to resilience, the more we can learn to, if you remember last week talking about tolerating our increasing our tolerance for unpleasant situations or sensations, when we can do that, we start to increase our tolerance to stress so that we can become more resilient. So, stress is not always bad, and we're not going to get rid of it. The key that we want to bring awareness to is to try to avoid the rumination and the worry that comes about when it's associated with a stressful event or a thought. When we have these chronic stressors, which we have a lot in today's society, we are chronically stressed almost from the minute that we wake up to the moment that we go to bed or try to go to sleep because we can't, because our mind is running so quickly about all the things we have to do tomorrow, all the things that we didn't do today, all the things we screwed up today, the stress of the worry and the rumination. When we're under that kind of chronic stress, what that does is keep our body activated in the very natural fight, flight, or freeze mechanism that we have that's wired into us. That fight, flight, or freeze is our sympathetic nervous system. It's our reptilian brain. And that system is designed to keep us out of danger. So, to do that, that system, when it perceives a threat or a stressor, it starts pumping adrenaline and cortisol to our bodies. So, that back in the day, what that did is that if we saw a saber-toothed tiger, that reptilian brain would kick in, it would start pumping adrenaline to our extremities so that we could run away back to the cave. And then we get back to the cave and, phew, stressor over, let's return back to our kind of homeostasis. What happens today is that we see saber-toothed tigers everywhere, around every corner. And to be sure, there are a lot more saber-toothed tigers out there today, both not literally, I don't even know if there are, but sort of metaphorically, there are a lot more saber-toothed tigers, a lot more dangers, stressors out there for us to deal with today. The problem comes in that we are constantly reacting to those. And so we are constantly activating our fight, flight, or freeze, constantly pumping adrenaline and cortisol throughout our system. And so what that does is it decreases our body's immune system and increases things like cellular aging, heart disease, cancer, respiratory illness. So it's having a physiological impact on our bodies when we are constantly in that elevated state of that fight, flight, or freeze. That kind of chronic stress also feeds what's called the negativity bias. And there's fascinating work by neuroscientists, one in particular, Rick Hansen, who has some amazing YouTube videos and articles that I highly recommend. And he's also a meditation teacher. And the negativity bias is essentially, again, this hard wiring. It's related to the fight, flight, or freeze mechanism. This hard wiring to scan our environment for threats or bad situations. So we're wired to scan for the saber-toothed tiger. And when we see it, that negativity bias gets reinforced because we're like, ah, yes, I knew it was going to be there. See? And so we've fed that negativity bias. Again, that had a purpose and still does have a purpose, obviously, in threatening situations. The issue today is that, again, we are constantly scanning for threats and for danger. And it's understandable, especially when we're talking about communities who are constantly threatened, that people in those communities are going to be scanning constantly for danger, constantly reinforcing that negativity bias, constantly feeding that stress. And as Rick Hansen says, your brain is like Velcro for negative experiences and Teflon for positive ones. Meaning that when we're constantly scanning for negative experience, we're going to, oop, there's one. Oop, there's one. Yep, that reaffirms yep, there's my fear right there. Constantly with that Velcro, like sucking those up. But then when something positive happens, we barely even notice it. And Rick Hansen has an awesome TED talk on this that I'll try and remember to share the link with Ashley, and she can share it in the follow-up email afterwards, that talks about how we can start to rewire that negativity bias so that we start wanting to absorb more positive experiences instead of being kind of magnetically drawn to the negativity ones, causing us more stress. And mindfulness can help reduce that negativity tendency. It can start to train our minds to soak up more of those positive experiences. Again, paying attention to the direct experience so that our parasympathetic nervous system can be activated. And what the parasympathetic nervous system is our mammalian brain, our caregiving brain. This is the system that allows our bodies and our minds to restore and heal. Because what happens when the parasympathetic system gets activated is the feel-good hormones like oxytocin and endorphins are released to kind of down-regulate the adrenaline and the cortisol and the stress of the reptilian brain. So mindfulness can help us cultivate more of activation of that parasympathetic nervous system. And what we can learn to do from that is start to gradually shift our focus of control. Because when we're in a situation where we are perceiving threats everywhere, constantly in that activated stressful state, we feel like I can't control what's happening to me. It's all coming at me. Everything is attacking me, coming down around me. Everything is happening to me. And what mindfulness invites us to do is begin to gradually shift that so we can start recognizing that I maybe can't control what's happening, the external sources of stress, but I can control my reaction, my response to it, and decrease my internal stress. In other words, decrease that resistance to the pain and decrease my suffering. And one of the most beautiful examples, and there are so many examples of people who, in the face of extreme stress and threats, are able to do that kind of shift. And one of them is Viktor Frankl, who is a Holocaust survivor. And he went on to be an author, a speaker, a psychiatrist or psychologist. I always get confused which one he was. And his book, Man's Search for Meaning, is one that I highly, highly recommend if you haven't read it yet, because he talks about his experience in the Holocaust and also his experience of how there are some people who were able to deal with that better than others, knowing they had no control over that situation whatsoever. And yet people like him who really came out of that and were able to survive through it were able to shift that locus of control onto how can I react to this situation. And so he has this beautiful quote that maybe some of you have heard: between the stimulus and the response, there is a space. This is where our freedom lies. It's in that space, in that mindful awareness of choice to how you want to react to that saber-toothed tiger. So how do we do this? That's a lot of information to come at you. And so, of course, well, what do we do now? As always, there are informal practices and formal practices. And the informal one that I want to pass along, that I pass along to clients and people that I know and that I do myself, is just the stop technique. which stands for slow your roll, take a moment to breathe, observe what's going on in the body, in the mind, and then proceed in whatever way feels right to you. So I'll use traffic as my example. Again, I love this example because this is talk about a practice. Being in traffic for me is a constant practice. And when somebody cuts me off or is tailgaters, talk about a trigger. I cannot, I'm still working on my reaction to tailgaters. When somebody is tailgating me, my initial reaction used to be, and still sometimes is, to tap on my brakes to send them a little message. I would not advise that, not maybe the safest practice. And yet that's my go-to. So what I try and work with is this very quick stop technique to notice when somebody comes roaring up behind me and they're tailgating me, slow my roll, not necessarily slow the car, slow my mental roll, my reaction. Take a moment to just take a beat, take a breath, notice, all right, this is really ticking me off. I'm feeling agitated. I have a lot of thoughts about this person. So I'm observing what's going on in the body, what my thoughts are, the stress that I feel, and then proceed in whatever way that feels right. Sometimes I tell myself a different story about why that person came roaring up on me. Maybe that person has a medical emergency. Maybe that person is having a really bad day and they're late for work. Maybe they have a loved one in the hospital or something happened at home, some emergency at home that they're trying to get to. So let me get out of their way because they clearly have someplace important that they need to be. That's how I proceed. Sometimes I proceed by still tapping the brakes, but again, it's a practice. I'm keeping it real. So that's a quick technique that you can sort of deploy in the moment. And the formal practice that I love a good acronym, and this is a hard acronym to remember. So I came up with, it's like a pirate, how a pirate's like, nar, matey. This is, if you can remember this when you have thoughts, like nar, nar to the thoughts. And it stands for notice the thought, name it. Is it worrying, judgment, blaming? I just realized, Ashley, I forgot the poll questions. So we'll do those before we do the practice. And then after you kind of name it, just allow it to be there. Again, without trying to shove that chattering companion in the closet, just allow the thought, like the wave on the ocean, to just be there. And then see if you can refuse to believe it, especially if it's a thought that's not serving you. So going back to my traffic example, my initial thought that came up was one of judgment, that somebody's just being a jerk. So I allow the thought to be there and then invite myself to refuse to believe it. What if they're not being a jerk? What if they have something going on? And what if I'm not a jerk for thinking that they were a jerk? And then return your awareness to the anchor. So this is you can use this informally or formally, but it helps to practice it formally so that you kind of have that, build that muscle memory more informally. So that's what we'll work on today. And I'm going to try and combine that with a little bit of the ocean vision. We'll see how that goes. But before we do that, Ashley, I totally talk about mindless. I get in the flow and I get going and I totally forgot about the poll questions. So we had a couple of poll questions. Ashley, do you have those? Do you want to still do those?
Yeah, I have them ready.
Okay, so we'll throw up the first one. What type of thoughts do you seem to have the most? And I sort of categorize these because a lot of our thoughts can kind of fall into these categories, but there may be some that I missed. So are your thoughts ones of planning for the future, judging yourself, judging other people, or worrying about the past or future, or maybe something else that doesn't fall into one of those categories?
Looks like we just have a couple more votes coming in.
Okay. And we're doing pretty good on time.
Okay, we'll go ahead and end that.
So what type of thoughts the most? Is there a dead tie between judgment of myself and worrying about past or future? 35% each. And 23% planning for the future, and 2% judgment of others. And then sort of others in the miscellaneous category of 6%. Yeah, so judgment of myself, so common, and that worry. Yeah. Very, very good frame of reference.
We had a comment too. It was hard to decide. Should have had all of the above.
True. Thank you. Yeah. All of the above. Yeah. And I'm curious, for those that voted other, if you feel comfortable sharing what other thoughts maybe you had, that would be helpful. And what was the second poll question? Yes. Which do you judge more of, myself or others? I'm guessing I know the answer to that one based on the previous one. Yeah. Changing my vote. And I want to just say one thing that is coming up for me a lot, as is for a lot of people in this country now, around racial injustice and the racial awakening that we're being called to. And I want to let people know that it is understandable that some of these things I'm saying about noticing your judgment of others or not buying into the story, for example, of race, these are such complicated and beautiful conversations to be having right now, that I really invite people, if those are conversations that you want to have, I would love to have those conversations with you, and encourage people to have those conversations with others, recognizing the stories that are coming up about racialized groups. And what is it that we have believed about those stories, that we've believed about ourselves in relation to racialized groups? And for the Black community and other people of color, what are the stories that you have heard told about yourself or your racialized group, and what have you come to believe? And so these are deep, difficult, and yet such beautiful conversations to be having right now. And I think it's very important to allow space to have those conversations. And so anybody who wants to explore that a little bit deeper, or who might want some insights on how to have those conversations with other people or with yourself, please, I invite you to reach out to me. So the results of the second poll, no surprise, judging myself is the big winner at 88%. Yeah. And I just want to leave you with another little seed here to think about. How does judging yourself impact how you see or judge other people? Just something to think about, maybe. Okay, so we'll go ahead and move into the practice today, and we'll do this for about 10 or 15 minutes so we can leave time for questions at the end. So again, go ahead and find a comfortable position for yourself, and we'll get started with this improv mindfulness of thoughts and see how this goes.
I wanted to tell you, Michelle, we had a few questions about it, like, because you asked if anybody wanted to share what they had the other for.
Oh, yeah.
Jess shared that relegating myself to least important so that others have more important needs, like family and issues, that can be able to have the autonomy to be present for them. Crystal shared, my worry of the past or future is usually centered on trying to interpret my judgment of myself and others. And then Susan, my
Mm.
answers have changed as I have aged, which is really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Which makes sense. Yeah. Those are such beautiful shares, by the way. Thank you for that. Really kind of peeling back the layers on some of those thoughts a little bit deeper. Yeah. Thank you for those. Okay. We'll ring the bell again. Allowing yourself to settle in again, reorienting yourself after this period of discussion and whatever thoughts, emotions, reactions you may be having around what was discussed here today. Gathering and collecting your attention and awareness. Closing down your eyes if that's comfortable, or just casting a soft gaze down. And beginning by taking one long, deep inhale through the nose. Noticing the air passing the tip of the nose and down the back of the throat, and how the chest and abdomen naturally rise. And pausing for just a moment to hold that inhale. And then exhaling through the mouth, letting the air out, letting out a sigh that invites the body to release any tension it can and to arrive into this practice. Letting the breath be however it is for you today. Whether it's deep or shallow, slow or fast, congested or easeful, allowing the breath to be however it is for you. Allowing the awareness to rest on the place wherever you can notice the breath the most. Maybe that's at the tip of the nose or the back of the throat, or in the rise and fall of the chest or abdomen. Taking a moment to connect in, to plug in to where you notice your breath the most. And allowing that anchor to be there for you. Resting the awareness in the background on that anchor, maybe at about 70% of your attention. And the rest of your awareness bringing to mind this vision of an ocean. As you're standing, watching the waves on the ocean, and you slowly and safely know that you can enter this ocean, that you'll be okay. You can allow yourself to be in these waves. Observing these waves as they come. Noticing, are they small and gentle ripples? Or are they more medium sized, with a little more energy? Or are they bigger, surfable waves that come crashing down on the ocean? And knowing that you can slip beneath the surface. As you sink down below the surface of these waves, you start to notice that in the depths of the ocean, there's more calm, a place in the ocean where you're not rocked by or swayed by the waves that are coming and going on the surface. This place in the ocean where you can rest yourself in your awareness and look up to the surface and observe the waves gathering, gathering, and then falling into the ocean and falling away, and then gathering again and falling away. Our mind is like the ocean. The waves on the ocean are always there. Sometimes they're small ripples, and sometimes they're bigger waves with more energy. And our thoughts are like those waves on our mind. Sometimes there are small passing thoughts that we don't even notice. And sometimes the thoughts have a little more energy behind them. And sometimes the thoughts are like the bigger crashing waves that crash down on our minds and our bodies. And yet, like the waves, we can notice how the thoughts gather, rise in our minds, and then fall away and give way into another thought that gathers, rises, and falls away. And just like we can sink beneath the surface of the ocean to observe those waves, we can allow ourselves to sink into our anchor, our breath, and allow that to be the place where we rest our awareness. And then when another wave, another thought comes, we begin by noticing it. Just noticing that the wave of thought is there. And then simply naming it as worry, planning, judgment, or even just thought, without getting too wrapped up in what the thought is, just naming it. And then allowing it to be there, just like we allow the waves on the ocean to be there. And then inviting ourselves to refuse to believe the thought. Because just like the ocean is not just its waves, you are not your thoughts. There is so much going on in the ocean besides the waves. And if we allow ourselves to get caught up in the waves, then it's easy to think that that's all the ocean is these waves. And yet, when we can sink below the surface and observe the waves, we see that the ocean is calm, has other life, has other currents, and that it's not defined by its waves. So when you refuse to believe your thoughts, you're refusing to believe that you are just your thoughts. You can drop back into your anchor and observe that you are so much more, that you are experiences, sensations, emotions, and a whole world within you, just like the whole world within the ocean. And then once you refuse to believe that thought, return your awareness to your breath, resting the awareness on your anchor. So, inviting you for the next few moments to practice this, resting the awareness on your anchor. And when a wave of thought comes up, notice it, name it, allow it to be there, refuse to believe it, and return the awareness to your anchor. Checking in to see if a wave of thoughts has come along and carried you away. Noticing the thought, naming it, allowing it to be there, refusing to believe it, and returning your awareness to the breath. Checking in again to see if you've gotten carried away on a wave of thought. Noticing, naming, allowing, refusing to believe, and returning the awareness to your anchor. Practicing this awareness and returning back to the anchor invites you to not identify with the thoughts, to not identify the entire ocean as just its waves. Finding that space between when the waves gather and rise and fall away before another wave gathers and rises and falls away. By bringing your awareness back to your anchor, you are creating that space between the thoughts, that moment when you allow yourself to be here with the direct experience of the present. And then when another thought comes, noticing, naming, allowing, refusing to believe, and returning back to the anchor to create that space before another thought comes. Gathering your awareness now fully back on the breath, letting go of this image of the ocean and the waves and the thoughts. Maybe taking some deep inhales and exhales to bring the awareness fully back into the breath and the body. And inviting a little movement into the body if that's comfortable for you. Maybe giving yourself a gentle stretch or shrug, moving your fingers or toes. Gently blinking your eyes open slowly, allowing the light to come in. Noticing the light in the room, the temperature, any sounds that you hear. And just allowing the benefits of this practice to sit with you, however that may be. As we're coming out of the meditation, there's a poem I would like to share that's called Oceans by Juan Ramon Jimenez. I have a feeling that my boat has struck down there in the depths against a great thing, and nothing happens. Nothing. Silence, waves, nothing happens? Or has everything happened? And are we standing now quietly in the new life? So, as always, I want to open up now to questions, reactions, feedback, whatever might be coming up for you. And if I can invite Ashley to help harness some of those. I like that harness. That might be my word for the day. And I will stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, Michelle, we do have a question already. It's asking, is nar, which I feel like I have to say that as a parrot, nar, mainly for negative thoughts? Because do I really want to refuse to believe all thoughts?
That's a great question. Of course, everybody asks great questions. As a lawyer, I try to be mindful of not telling a judge, oh, that's a great question, Your Honor. And yet I do it all the time. So no, there's no non-great question. Yeah, my invitation, especially when you're starting to work with this, so as not to be deterred or sort of all caught up in the philosophy of the practice. Do I really want to not believe my positive thoughts? We can sort of go down that road, but as you're initially coming into this practice, the invitation is to use it to work with the negative, for lack of a better word, but maybe going back to the terms from last week, the unpleasant or maybe the neutral thoughts, just like there are unpleasant or neutral emotions, using this practice to maybe work with the unpleasant ones. Because again, where there is real power in this practice is to start recognizing where we're having thoughts that are holding us back. So that would be my recommendation, is to start working with, yeah, the negative or the thoughts that aren't serving you might be a better way to look at it.
Another question: how does a person keep from beginning to doze when meditating? And someone else just chimed in, like, I try not to be too warm. That's what helps them.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. First of all, sleepiness, so common. So please try not to judge yourself for being sleepy when you meditate, because people are tired. That's okay. So, one question to ask is, am I getting enough sleep? And do I maybe need to take a nap if you can? But the second question is, if you doze off and fall asleep, that's okay. Again, don't judge yourself for that. And also, this is where some of the posture can help with that. So, if you can make sure that you are sitting in a posture that is, as I say, with some dignity and alertness, and yet not too rigid, because you don't want to be, you know, stiff when you're meditating, but a posture that's more upright so that you're not slouching back in a chair or couch. And if you're deciding to lay down, that's where I talked, I think in the first session maybe, there's a position that you, if you're lying down, pretend like the floor is behind me, so that I'm lying down and my hands are up in the air so that your arms are at 90-degree angles. And that way, if you do start to fall asleep, your arm's going to move and kind of wake you up. So, yeah, sleepiness is natural. It's okay. And yet, if you can be awake, then that's going to contribute to the practice of mindfulness. And so, using some of those posture tips to sort of help with your alertness might encourage you to stay more awake.
Couple comments here. So, one of them shared, just as the waves of the ocean are based upon the lay of the land underneath, so are my thoughts. Am I making a mountain out of a molehill? Can my mountain become a plateau? I guess that is the way I will view this.
Can the mountain become, so? If I'm understanding the question, what I'm imagining is that, and who asked that question? Is there a name associated with that?
Don't. I just have an S number on that one.
Okay, no worries. So S. I'm imagining that what's coming up for you is that the foundation that is contributing to or creating the thoughts might be bumpy, might be rough. If that's the question, if I'm understanding that correctly, that's a first of all, that's a great visual aid. So it's really cool that you came up with that. And so, maybe for you, it's not dropping below, or maybe it's both dropping below and kind of hovering above. But in inviting yourself to wherever it's comfortable, whatever visual or representation you need, to be the observer. So whether that's the observer sort of looking down on the thoughts, or the observer looking up at the thoughts, yeah, I think that's a really cool way to make that individualized. The point is just to be the observer of the thoughts, and recognizing that the thought had, as I said before, that's probably like a baby gremlin thought that came from a mommy or daddy gremlin thought. And so there's always the invitation to once you recognize the thought, okay, well, what's behind that thought? It's not something we've practiced and didn't necessarily talk about here today. But once you start becoming aware of the thoughts that aren't serving you, if you can start to increase your awareness to, well, what's behind that? This kind of gets to asking yourself, is it really true? So it sounds like you're going a little bit deeper into that foundation of, is that thought really true? What's underneath that? And then what's underneath that? And you can sort of keep going and kind of get all the way back to what is likely to be some notion of something isn't enough. So that's a really cool question. Thank you for that. I hope I answered it. Or I'm not even sure if there was a question in there. Maybe it was just an observation for you. But if there's anything lingering around that, let me know.
Really cool thought from Crystal here. Not identifying myself as the sum of my thoughts is very powerful. The ocean is more than waves is going to be my go-to in remembering that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I'm glad that landed for you.
Just a couple about these exercises are very relaxing from Barb. Kate, today's topic has been very emotional one for me. Lots of practice to do here.
Yeah. Catherine, thank you for sharing that. And if I can offer a bit of consolation or recommendation to allow those emotions, going back to last week, this is where there's the invitation to really start to deepen your practice, to allow those emotions to be there. Again, remembering the rain practice and continuing to work with the thoughts, noticing what emotions are coming up because of the thoughts and the discussions that we've had today. And something just occurred to me, if in case folks are wondering, well, I'm having a thought, so should I do the NAR practice because there's an emotion coming up, so should I do the rain practice? What should I do? Do what you want, like make it your own. And when all else fails, do a practice of resting the awareness on the breath and allowing for whatever is coming up, allowing for whatever waves, whether those are waves of thoughts, waves of emotions, noticing when they come up. This goes back to the first or second talk we had of sort of the three basics of mindfulness, which are resting the awareness on the breath, noticing what comes up, and without judgment, returning the awareness to the breath. So if there are, it's understandable that things are really starting to kind of percolate a little bit, and maybe some things are getting stirred up. And so inviting you to, this is where the mindfulness practice can really come into play, and extending some compassion to yourself for whatever is coming up, which of course, compassion is our last one next week. And that reminds me, as some of these questions are rolling in, I want to come back to the question I had at the beginning. I'm curious what folks' reactions are to doing this mindfulness of thoughts now. Is this something that you would have rather have done before we did the emotions talk, or even earlier? Or do you like doing the mindfulness of thoughts topic now? I'm really interested in that feedback.
As they're kind of thinking about that one, I just wanted to share from Anne, I need to do this in the moment. The hard part for me is remembering to do it.
Yeah. And that's such an important comment, because this is where the formal practice of mindfulness will help with that in the moment. Because I go back to a working out analogy. You wouldn't go to the gym and expect to like lift a 50-pound dumbbell. I don't know, maybe you would, maybe you're super strong. But whatever it is, you wouldn't expect to like lift a huge dumbbell, or you wouldn't expect to go out tomorrow and run a marathon if you haven't been training. And so going back to the very first talk where we talked about mindfulness is this deliberate training of our attention so that we can build the concentration. So to help us remember in the moment, to be more mindful, it helps to have the formal practice so that we're training that attention muscle. We're training that concentration so it comes in, so it kicks in the moment.
A lot of people just saying, I think the placement is good. I think dealing with the more negative is better later. Timing is great. This was a tough topic. We needed to work up to it. Flow of the sessions are great. I think it's well situated. Emotions can often make thinking feel too heavy to unpack. Either way is fine, but since emotions come from thoughts very often, I would do thoughts first. I think it's good now because we've learned the vocabulary of mindfulness. Flow of the session is good.
Okay. Yeah, super helpful feedback. I really appreciate that. And I kind of bounce back and forth because it's sort of a chicken and egg problem. Thoughts kind of precipitate the emotions, and yet sometimes, as some folks have said, it's easier to come into the thoughts piece of it after having some of that foundation. So, yeah, thanks for that. I really appreciate it. Want to be mindful of folks' time today. As usual, I'm happy to stick around if there are questions that folks want to ask. I do need to be gone by like quarter of. Um, I'm sad that next week is our last one. I am too. I want to say I'm glad you're sad, but I'm glad that seems to indicate you've enjoyed it and thus you're sad it's ending. But yeah, thanks so much again to everybody for showing up and for giving yourself this time and space today. And Ashley will be sending out the email with the slides and also the journals again, for you to take or leave or do with as you please. But they have some suggestions for meditations in there that might be helpful for working with the mindfulness of thoughts. All right. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions, so I think we can close it out. Ashley, thank you so much again for all your amazing help. And yes, I thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And I hope everyone continues to stay well and be safe. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody.